Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky calls the liberation of the Kherson city the beginning of the end of the war.
American and Chinese presidents Joe Biden and Xi Jinping meet for the first time as leaders at the G20 Summit in Bali.
G20 leaders begin summit talks in Bali in a bid to mend bilateral relations and the global economy, despite being overshadowed by the war in Ukraine.
France and Italy continue a dispute over humanitarian rescue ships as Paris and London sign a historic English Channel crossing deal.
The EU imposes a new round of sanctions against Iran, targeting 29 individuals for the brutal repression of anti-government protests.
Tears of joy and relief overcame Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky during his surprise visit to Kherson city. His troops have regained control of the region's capital, and for the president, emboldened by his men's efforts, this could spark the beginning of the end of the war.
It was not so pleasant when I saw the number of destroyed houses, the number of destroyed ordinary coffee shops. This is what the Russian Federation did in our country. It showed the whole world that it can kill. But all of us, our armed forces, our intelligence, have shown that it's impossible to kill Ukraine.
In Russia, meanwhile, the silence is telling as it played down its withdrawal of troops from the region.
We leave it without comment. You know that it's the territory of the Russian Federation.
The NATO Secretary General did have something to say. From The Hague, Jens Stoltenberg reminded us that the conflict is far from over and the months ahead will be challenging.
The coming months will be difficult. Putin's aim is to leave Ukraine cold and dark this winter. So we must stay the course.
Indeed, the Russians destroyed Kherson's basic infrastructure before abandoning the city, which augurs very difficult times. For the residents, readapting will take a long time. But for now, the joy is there for us all to see.
As Kherson emerges from occupation, Ukraine's troops are reclaiming the city metre by metre, making safe buildings abandoned by the Russians. Locals have been celebrating the Russian retreat, but without essentials like a functioning water supply, residents have been driven to desperate measures.
I can say that we're dealing with a municipal catastrophe. We have no water, no electricity, no heating. That's why we're forced somehow to cope with it. It's a real pity that my children have to face such a situation. I have 2 small children here and we haven't managed to leave. But thank God, we're all alive and our houses are okay.
Ukraine's technicians are trying to repair a major power station, which previously supplied the entire right bank of the Kherson region. The chief of Ukraine's national energy supplier described the destruction as the consequence of the powerless anger of the occupiers before fleeing. After a surprise visit to the newly liberated city, President Zelensky used his nightly address to condemn Russia as the occupiers who destroy everything. This is their so-called special operation, he said. For Russia, it appears to have been left internationally isolated by the invasion of Ukraine, an impression underlined by the 5th critical UN resolution. It called for Moscow to be held accountable for its actions and was supported by 94 of the General Assembly's 193 members. It said Russia must bear the legal consequences of all of its internationally wrongful acts, including making reparations for injury and damage.
Smiles and a handshake between the American and Chinese leaders, Joe Biden and Xi Jinping, at the G20 Summit in Bali. It's their first face-to-face meeting since Biden took office. Relations between the two world powers have grown frosty under successive American administrations, with issues such as trade, human rights, and the status of Taiwan causing friction. But for now, at least, there's talk of limited cooperation.
I'm committed to keeping the lines of communications open between you and me personally, but our governments across the board, because our two countries have so much that we have an opportunity to deal with.
China's foreign ministry has said that the country is committed to peaceful coexistence, but would firmly defend its sovereignty, security and development interests. Despite the differences, lines of communication at the highest level remain open.
On 14th of November, both America and China presidents landed here in Bali, Indonesia. They chose this place to shake hands for the first time after maybe about 5 years. After 3 hours conversation, one thing is clear: no Cold War is coming between USA and China. Joe Biden made it clear he is not looking for a conflict with China. He also said that the eye-to-eye meetings and the personal conversations are the only way of solving the issues between the two states. China's President Xi Jinping also said that the two countries are obliged to find the right direction in the policy between them. Biden and Xi Jinping meet for the first time after a long way, and when the relations between the two states are at their lowest point. They meet just before the G20 Summit, and actually they pushed away the agenda. Before a couple of months, even American officials said that China is the main challenge, the long-term challenge before America, because China is the only state that have the intentions and the actual power of changing world order. Today, the conclusions seem to have softened, and the two presidents showed signs that they're ready for a dialogue and stepping a little back. They said they're ready to move forward on some of the topics like food supply, climate change, and health security. And also, the main thing, the communication between the two states should stay open. Furthermore, the Secretary of State Blinken will visit China to follow up on their discussion today. The White House said that. Taiwan, of course, is top of their agenda. China warned USA against crossing the red lines there and the policy of one country. US President Joe Biden said they should prevent competition from becoming anything even near a conflict. Two presidents also discussed the situation in Ukraine, the Russian invasion, also the sanctions against Russia and the nuclear attempts of North Korea. From Bali, Indonesia, Nadia Gancheva.
The leaders of the G20 nations and other international heads get down to business today in Bali for the annual summit. The event is being overshadowed by Russia's war in Ukraine. Although President Vladimir Putin has pulled out, Russia is being represented by Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Even so, officials say an end-of-summit statement will be issued in which most members are expected to condemn Russia's aggression. There have been several significant bilateral meetings on the sidelines of the main summit, including talks between the presidents of France and China, during which several issues were raised.
You mentioned the climate issue, to name just one, and probably the most important one. But also there are international crises like Russia's war in Ukraine, for which the G20 is an appropriate format.
Xi, meanwhile, made no mention of the conflict in his opening remarks, calling more broadly for the two countries to uphold the spirits of independence, autonomy, openness and cooperation. This is a summit of several introductions, including the first in-person talks between President Xi and US President Joe Biden, who said afterwards the meeting had been conciliatory. Topics included Ukraine, Taiwan and human rights. The G20, which is being held in Indonesia against a backdrop of numerous sources of tension, is the biggest gathering by the group of leaders since the start of the coronavirus pandemic.
US Democrat Katie Hobbs has defeated her Republican rival Carrie Lake in the race for governor of Arizona, the first time a Democrat has been elected to lead the state since 2006. Hobbs, who's Arizona's Secretary of State, fiercely defended the legitimacy of the 2020 presidential election, while Lake, a former TV anchor backed by Donald Trump, questioned the results. Lake's defeat is the latest blow for former President Trump, who's been blamed for Republicans' poor showing in this month's midterm elections, including their failure to take control of the US Senate. The party is still expected to win back the House of Representatives from Democrats, but by a much smaller margin than predicted. Trump himself is due to make what he's teased as a big announcement later today, widely expected to be the official launch of his 2024 presidential campaign. But unlike recent years, Republican politicians and voters appear divided, with some now throwing their support to Florida Governor Ron DeSantis.